Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGT. And coming up on today's program, the top leaders of China and India met in an informal meeting to mend strained relations. Could the world's biggest developing economies and most populous nations find common ground to better work with each other? And the world is watching. DPRK leader Kim Jong-un set foot on South Korean soil as he met with President Moon Jae-in from the south at the Truce Village on the border. Could the meeting indeed herald a new age of peace, as Kim declared? You are watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin our program today with the informal meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the central Chinese city of Wuhan from Friday to Saturday. The meeting is expected to improve mutual trust and build consensus to put bilateral ties back on track. Before the discussion, take a look at this.
Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in heart-to-heart talks in Wuhan today. It's a much-needed opportunity for strategic communication at the top level. Both sides sought in-depth talks in a relaxed setting on issues vital to long-term bilateral ties. The meeting is seen as the perfect chance for such brainstorming. Although the diplomatic initiative seemed somewhat of a surprise, it did not come out of the blue. Last summer, India and China locked horns in their most serious border standoff in 5 decades, the Donglan crisis. The two leaders broke the ice at the 9th BRICS summit last September in China's Xiamen after the border standoff. It helped both sides to recognize the importance of crisis management and cooperation. As President Xi has stressed, the Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant must not fight but dance with each other. The common interests of China and India far outweigh their differences as they work on a better Asia in the historic meeting.
So, is the Chinese dragon in a new dance with the Indian elephant indeed? Well, with us in our Beijing studio, Liu Youfa, who's a senior research fellow at the Bengal institution. It is actually called Pangu in Chinese.
Yes.
He is the former Chinese Consul General in Mumbai. Welcome, sir, to our program.
You're welcome.
And also in New Delhi, India, we have Mr. Uday Bhaskar, who is the director of the Society for Policy Studies. He's a retired commander who served in the Indian Navy and also one of India's leading experts and on security, strategic affairs. I want to welcome both of you. First of all, why Wuhan? Mr. Liu, this time, why informal too between the two leaders?
Prime Minister Modi has come to China for the 3rd time, and this is the 4th time. He's been to Guangzhou quite a few times, Beijing, Shanghai, and Xi'an. Now he wants to pick each and every major part of China for him to see for the first hand. So this is the first, part, and the second part is with regard to informal. Because in 2 or 3 weeks, he's going to participate in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Qingdao. For some urgent matters, Prime Minister Modi found it obliged to have closer dialogues with President Xi Jinping, so that they too could have common stand, prior to the Qingdao, summit.
Okay. Mr. Bhaskar, coming from India, what do you make of the two leaders' interactions since the last time crisis? Remember that on the border between China and India. Do you think the two sides have managed since then to be able to check the bilateral relations so that it would not go out of control in a way?
I think that would be a fair characterization that after the incident that took place last year, what we in India refer to as the Doklam crisis, President Xi in China and Prime Minister Modi in India met in September last year, and my sense is that they came to a conclusion that this kind of a situation should not be allowed to in any way disrupt the bilateral relationship. And what President Xi, I think, has very interesting characterization, spoke about, can the dragon and the elephant learn to dance? I would say that from September last year to the current meeting in Wuhan, both the Indian and Chinese top leadership are determined to see how they can ensure that the areas of common interest will in a way allow them to accommodate and embed whatever be the differences, of which I would say Doklam was the most recent manifestation.
Right. Well, on the other hand, let's take a look at what has happened since that crisis. There's the BRICS summit taking place in China then. After that, there was also the 19th Party Congress, after which Prime Minister Modi congratulated the Chinese President Xi Jinping for being the leader of the new generation in a way into the new era. And then we also see Chinese side trying to share once again river data with India side and also resume low-level military exercises and interactions which were suspended during the crisis. So it seems that both sides have been interacting with one another, but those are not necessarily the things that is likely to decide the fate of nature relationship between these two countries. So Mr. Liu, if I could ask you about that, what exactly is going to be the relations between China and India? If you could use some term, is it going to be a partnership or rivalry?
India and China.
Well, I heard some hesitation, Mr. Liu, from you.
Strategic partnership in the year 2005. Ever since then, the bilateral relations went through, zigs and zags, highs and lows.
Right.
But in general, the two countries have been pushing forward the cooperative relations in many areas. As with regard to the partnership, I would say the bilateral relations between India and China are now mainly driven by the convergence of interest. So it's the partnership plus the competitors on the base of rules.
Okay, let me ask you, Mr. Bhaskar. The world is changing fast, we all know that. It used to be the world order, but now a lot of things have been challenged and been changing, it seems. So under these circumstances, how is India going to map out its all types of options, including its option with China vis-a-vis its options with the other countries? What do you think about this strategic issue? How is that being, in a way, debated and argued about within India?
In India, there is a lot of debate and discussion, and I want to pick up the point made by Mr. Liu, that if you look at the last few years, while the differences and the divergences, like, say, Doklam, have definitely come into the public domain, and there is a lot of visibility, India and China also have a certain, I would say, track record of very meaningful partnership at the global level, particularly in areas like, for instance, climate change. You will remember that when the Paris Agreement was going on, India and China played a very critical role in ensuring that there was a consensus which also protected the interests of the developing countries. In the current phase, I think if you look at what is happening in the United States and the kind of policies that are being adopted by President Donald Trump, it appears that the global trade patterns are now being challenged, and a certain degree of protectionism or even trade wars may be on the anvil. For instance, the United States and the European Union on steel and aluminium tariffs. So in this kind of a world, I think China and India are perhaps looking to see how they could maximize their own positions to ensure that certain principles of globalization and free trade are in a way enabled and made stronger. My sense is that both President Xi and Prime Minister Modi would be discussing this in Wuhan.
Is that going to be one of the dancing steps, Mr. Liu, that the Chinese President Xi Jinping has been talking about between the Chinese dragon and the Indian elephant, about trade?
Yes. We talked about, let me just compliment Mr. Bhaskar in what he mentioned as the trade war between U.S. and China. As I look at it, the essence of the latest trade disputes between U.S. and China is the reckless policy behavior by the U.S. government to address the trade issues with partners in accordance with its domestic laws. This is at the expense of all the international trade partners rather than China alone. So in this regard, it is the obligation of all the international community, China and India included, to form the united front line to oppose openly the unilateral trade policies.
But you know, people have been talking about maybe if China is not getting all of those deals, some of the other developing and emerging economy could get the contract. So, Mr. Liu, is India the real partner in that regard to safeguard the international trading system? Or actually there are different ways of looking at it from different perspectives? Mr. Liu, very briefly from you.
Yeah, as Mr. Bhaskar, my good friend, has just mentioned, China and India are the natural allies in protecting the multilateral trade mechanism and to promote the, to maintain the free trade. And these are the two areas where China have to work with India, vice versa.
Right. When we talk about working together, the two of you probably have to tackle one question very urgently. What about the Belt and Road Initiative? As we understand, Mr. Bhaskar, earlier there are differences between China and India over whether China should have the kind of cooperation with Pakistan regarding certain areas of development along the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, China said, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative is very inclusive. We have a lot of different options to work with different countries. Mr. Bhaskar, how is that sounding to India so far? What kind of option do you think the two countries, China and India I'm talking about, could have in that regard?
Well, first of all, I would say that as far as the China-Pakistan cooperation, the Sino-Pakistan cooperation is concerned, I think it would be a very positive kind of initiative by China if it can help to stabilize Pakistan, which, as we are all aware, is going through a series of domestic crises as far as its security is concerned. We have the challenge of terrorism, which since 9/11 has become a very, very major and complex challenge for Pakistan internally. And much of that has to do with the fact that the Pakistani military, for its own reasons, believes that it must support certain terror groups which are against Afghanistan and against India. And I'm sure the Chinese professionals are aware about this. From the Indian perspective, I think, as far as the current Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, India has already conveyed what you might call as its own reservations about the Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, because that has got certain implications for India's sovereignty in relation to the composite state, as we call it.
So, Mr. Bhaskar, what I'll try to ask you is about what about the new possibilities? Is there going to be any? Is there going to be any new possibilities besides repeating the earlier statement?
I think so.
Go ahead. What is it?
Short answer, Madam, is that yes, I think. If I could respond, I would say that some new possibilities can be explored by Prime Minister Modi and President Xi in such a way that the Chinese priority for development can be maintained, while India's concerns about sovereignty can also be acknowledged and they could be dealt with in the appropriate way. Because the last point, I think both China and India have an interest in a stable Pakistan and the issue of terrorism, which is now going to come up in the meeting in the SCO, where China is in the driver's seat. So I think it's an important issue.
There are a lot of on the agenda. Go ahead, Mr. Liu.
Yes. I could contribute to what Mr. Bhaskar has said. It is a matter of fact that the current Indian policy position vis-a-vis Belt and Road Initiative is contributed not only by its domestic policies, but also because of some of the miscommunications and misperceptions on both sides. I think President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi will have some discussions in this regard to dispel the misperception and try to explain to the Prime Minister Modi that the BRI construction can be carried out not only through the regional mechanisms, but also through the bilateral channels, to which India will have a much stake in joining the BRI construction.
Of course, China and India, as we all know, has a big trade relationship. China is the largest trading partner of India, according to the latest information. 2017 bilateral trade volume between the two countries rose by a little more than 20% and hit a record high of nearly $85 billion, according to Chinese Ministry of Commerce. There we go, some numbers over there. On top of that, where should the two countries go? Before we go about this discussion, I want to ask the two of you, seems to be the trend these days that we are likely to have bilateral, highest level discussions, even before the lowest level officials trying to figure out what the blueprint could be. It's happened with the United States, South Korea, happened possibly with the United States and North Korea, North and South Korea, as we are going to tackle a little bit later in our program. What about China, India? It seems that this informal summit, in a way, is trying to set the basis about what's to come next. Mr. Liu.
It is a fashion that international conferences, summit meetings, the informal meetings have become a very effective tool for the leaders to come sit together, compare notes, make tough decisions, which would in turn translate it into the policy guidelines for the two governments in addressing the thorny issues, outstanding issues, one by one over the time.
All right, Mr. Bhaskar, 20 seconds left for you. Your thought.
I would say that geoeconomics is a very important component today when nations are outlining their priorities, and President Xi Jinping has very often referred to his own vision where there would be a greater prosperity for the people of China. Mr. Modi in India says the same thing, and in the tweet that he put out before he embarked on the plane for Wuhan was to say that how can India's national development priorities be harmonized with China in a strategic sense. So I think the geoeconomic compulsion is a very strong one. As Mr. Liu says, I hope the outcome of Wuhan will be positive in this domain.
Uday Bhaskar, Liu Youfa, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us and share your insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody.